The security guard looked at me like I was a stranger. That was the first sign that something had gone very wrong. It was 8:17 on a Monday morning when I walked into the lobby of the building where I had worked for almost 9 years. I was carrying my usual black coffee, my laptop bag, and a folder of reports I had planned to present to the executive team that morning. I walked toward the security desk. "Morning, James." James didn't smile. He looked down at his computer. Then he looked back at me. "Can I see your ID?" I laughed. "My ID?" "Yes." "James, I've been coming through this lobby for almost 9 years." "I know." His voice was quiet. Too quiet. I handed him my company badge. He scanned it. The machine beeped, then displayed a red warning. "Access denied." I stared at the screen. "What?" James swallowed. "Your access has been deactivated." I thought he was joking. "By who?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Corporate security." I looked toward the elevators. "Can you reactivate it?" "No." "Why?" He looked uncomfortable. "I was told not to let you upstairs." I stared at him. "Who told you?" "The office manager." "Which office manager?" "Melissa." "Of course. Melissa Grant, our new operations director." She had been hired only 4 months earlier. And for the last several weeks, she had been acting like she owned the place. I stepped away from the security desk. "Call my manager." James shook his head. "I'm sorry." "James, call him." "I can't." "Why?" "Because he told me not to." My heart started beating faster. I walked toward the elevators. The guard stepped in front of me. "Mr. Carter." I stopped. "You can't go upstairs." I looked at him. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes." "Then move." He didn't. For a moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger. Not fear. Betrayal. I had helped build this company. I had spent 9 years working inside this building. I had worked weekends. I had answered calls at midnight. I had stayed through layoffs. I had helped the company survive its worst financial year. And now I was standing in the lobby like a trespasser. I pulled out my phone. I called my manager. No answer. I called again. Nothing. Then my phone buzzed. An email. The subject line was, "Employment status update." I opened it. The message was short. "Effective immediately, your employment with Westbridge Solutions has been terminated. Please do not attempt to access company premises. Your personal belongings will be collected and delivered to you." I read it twice. Then a third time. Terminated. No meeting. No warning. No explanation. Just an email. I looked at the security guard. "Who authorized this?" He looked away. I already knew. My manager, David. And Melissa. But there was something neither of them knew. Something they should have checked before they changed the locks. The company didn't own the building. Neither did David. Neither did Melissa. And neither did the investment group that had recently acquired Westbridge. The building was owned by a private property company. A company I controlled. And Westbridge's right to occupy the entire building came from one document. The master lease. A lease that I had personally negotiated years earlier. A lease that gave my company the right to operate there. But it also gave the property owner something far more important. The right to terminate Westbridge's occupancy if the company violated certain conditions. And I was the managing partner of that property company. I hadn't told anyone at Westbridge. There had never been a reason to. Until that morning. They thought they had locked me out. They didn't realize They had just locked themselves out of the building they depended on. And before that week was over, everyone in that lobby would learn exactly who held the keys. My name is Daniel Carter. At least, that's what people called me before the company decided I was no longer useful. I joined Westbridge Solutions when it was barely more than an idea. There were 12 employees, one small office, a handful of customers, and a founder named Richard Weston who believed he could turn a struggling software company into something much bigger. I was 32 when I joined. My title was Operations Manager. It wasn't glamorous, but I didn't care. I liked building systems. I liked solving problems. And Westbridge had plenty of problems. The company had poor contracts, weak internal controls, late payments, unorganized customer records, and an office lease that was about to expire. The old office was too small. We needed somewhere larger. Richard asked me to find a new location. I searched for weeks. Then I found the building. 32 floors, modern offices, a central location, underground parking, conference facilities, and enough space for Westbridge to grow for years. There was only one problem. The rent was expensive. Very expensive. Richard couldn't afford the asking price. So I negotiated. The landlord was a family-owned property group. They didn't want another short-term tenant. They wanted stability. I offered them something different. A long-term master lease. Westbridge would lease several floors initially, with expansion rights. The property company would have a reliable tenant. Westbridge would have predictable rent. Everyone won. But there was one condition. The landlord wanted a personal guarantee from someone financially strong enough to back the agreement. Richard couldn't provide it. So I did. At the time, I had invested heavily in real estate. I owned several commercial properties through a holding company called Carter Property Holdings. I offered the guarantee. The landlord accepted. The lease was signed. Westbridge moved in. And over the next 9 years, the company grew. 20 employees became 50. 50 became 200. Then 400. The building became part of Westbridge's identity. The lobby carried our logo. Customers came there for meetings. Employees parked there. Executives held conferences there. People assumed Westbridge owned the space. It didn't. My property company did. I never hid that fact legally. The lease was properly recorded. Westbridge's legal department had copies. Its finance department had copies. Richard knew. But after Richard retired, leadership changed. Investors came in. New executives arrived. And slowly, the people who had been there for years stopped paying attention to the details. That's how Melissa entered the story. She was smart, confident, ambitious, and very good at making people believe she was more important than she actually was. She became director of operations. Then she became David's closest advisor. David was my direct manager. He had once been a good leader. But after the investment group acquired a controlling interest in Westbridge, he changed. Suddenly, every decision was about cutting costs. Who could be removed? Which department could be reduced? Which executive could be replaced? And eventually, they started asking the question that would change my life. Do we still need Daniel? I heard about it from a colleague. At first, I didn't believe it. Then I noticed the meetings. The invitations I stopped receiving. The projects being reassigned. The reports I was asked to prepare, but no longer allowed to present. And finally, there was Melissa. She started taking over my responsibilities. I confronted David. Is there something I need to know? He smiled. You're imagining things. I don't think I am. We're restructuring. Am I part of the restructuring? He paused. Nothing has been decided. I believed him. That was my mistake. Because while I was worrying about my job, they were planning something much bigger. And while they were planning to lock me out, they never bothered to check who controlled the building. The investment group had purchased Westbridge 6 months earlier. Their plan was simple: cut expenses, increase profits, sell the company within 3 years. I understood the strategy. There was nothing wrong with wanting efficiency. But David and Melissa weren't interested in careful restructuring. They wanted fast results. They began removing experienced employees. People who had worked at Westbridge for years were suddenly told their positions were no longer aligned with the company's strategic direction. That phrase became a joke inside the office. One employee even printed it on a coffee mug. Then they targeted me. I wasn't cheap. My salary reflected 9 years of experience. I also had a strong contract. And I had enough knowledge of the company's operations to challenge bad decisions. That made me inconvenient. Melissa once said during a meeting, "Daniel knows too much." I wasn't supposed to hear it. But I did. I didn't confront her. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every meeting. Every instruction. Every change. Every decision. Not because I wanted revenge. Because something didn't feel right. Then one Thursday afternoon, David called me into his office. He closed the door. "Daniel, we've decided to make some changes." I sat down. "What kind?" "We're eliminating your position." I stared at him. "I see. We're giving some of your responsibilities to Melissa." "Effective when?" "Immediately." "Why?" "Budget." I almost smiled. "Budget?" "Yes. After 9 years." David looked uncomfortable. "It's a business decision." I nodded. "I understand." He seemed surprised by my calmness. "You'll receive your severance package." "Fine. And you'll need to turn in your access card." I looked at him. "Today?" "Yes." "Why?" "We want to secure the premises." I leaned back. "Secure it from me." He didn't answer. I stood. "Okay." I handed him my badge. He took it. Then he said, "I hope you understand." I looked at him. "I understand perfectly." I walked out. What he didn't know was that I had already spoken to my attorney. 3 months earlier, Westbridge had violated a clause in the master lease. They had subleased part of the property to another company without the required approval. I had warned their legal department. They ignored me. Then they did it again. That second violation mattered. Under the lease, repeated unauthorized subleasing gave the landlord the right to issue a formal notice of default. I didn't act. I gave them time to fix it. But they never did. And now they had fired me. The same person who had spent years protecting the company's interests was suddenly being treated as a threat. I left the office that evening. I thought that was the end. It wasn't. Monday morning proved that. After receiving the termination email, I walked out of the building. I sat in my car. My hands were shaking. I wasn't afraid of losing my job. I had savings, investments, options. What hurt was the way they had done it. 9 years. And not even a conversation. I called my attorney. Her name was Laura Bennett. She had helped me establish Carter Property Holdings years earlier. She answered immediately. "Daniel." They terminated me. There was silence. "Today?" "Yes." "Did they give you notice?" "No." "Did they provide a reason?" "Budget restructuring." She sighed. "Of course. There's something else." What? They changed the building access. Laura was silent again. They locked you out. Yes. Did they know you were the managing partner? No. Did anyone at Westbridge know? The old legal team knew. Not the new management. Apparently not. She laughed softly. This could become interesting. I wasn't laughing. Laura, I don't want to hurt anyone. I know. I want this handled professionally. Then we start with the lease. Do we enforce the default? She paused. That's your decision. I looked through the windshield at the building. 32 floors. Hundreds of employees. Millions of dollars of equipment. The entire company was inside. If I issue a default notice, what happens? They have a cure period. And if they don't fix it, we can pursue termination according to the lease. I exhaled. So they fired me from a building they don't control. That's one way to describe it. I almost smiled. What would you do? I'm your attorney. Just answer. She paused. I would give them one chance. To do what? Fix the lease violations. And if they refuse, then you stop protecting people who don't respect the agreement. I knew she was right. So I told her, prepare the notice. The default notice arrived at Westbridge on Tuesday morning. It was addressed to the CEO. It listed the violations: unauthorized subleasing, failure to obtain required landlord consent, failure to maintain certain insurance requirements, and one more issue. A modification to the premises had been made without approval. None of these issues alone was catastrophic. Together, they were serious. The notice gave Westbridge 30 days to cure the violations. I didn't mention my termination. I didn't mention the security incident. I didn't mention the humiliation in the lobby. The notice was purely contractual, professional, legal, predictable. David called me that afternoon. His voice was angry. You did this. I didn't write the lease. You know what I mean. I issued a notice. You're retaliating. No. You were fired. Correct. And now you're threatening the company. I'm enforcing the lease. You can't do this. Actually, I can. Silence. Then he said, Daniel, you're making a huge mistake. No. I looked at the documents on my desk. You made the mistake. He hung up. An hour later, Melissa called. She was calmer. Daniel. Melissa. We need to talk. About the lease. Yes. You should speak with your legal department. I want to speak with you. Why? Because I know you're angry. I'm not angry. You've issued a notice that could force the company to move. Only if the company refuses to comply. We're willing to comply. Then there's no problem. She paused. Can we meet? I thought about it. Sure. We met the next morning at a coffee shop across from the building. Melissa looked confident. She placed a folder on the table. We can settle this. Good. We'll fix the insurance issue. Fine. The sublease can be reviewed. Fine. And the modifications can be documented. Fine. She looked frustrated. That's it. What else? You don't want compensation. No. You don't want your job back. I looked at her. Why would I? Because you spent 9 years there. I spent 9 years building something. Don't you miss it? I thought about the building. Then I answered. I miss what the company used to be. She looked away. Then she said, Daniel, we made a mistake. What mistake? Firing you. That surprised me. Why? Because we didn't realize how connected you were to the property. I smiled. That's not the reason you regret firing me. She didn't answer. She knew I was right. The real problem was that they had assumed I was just an employee. They hadn't bothered to understand the structure around them. 2 days later, Westbridge's new legal team requested the full lease history. They found my name. Then they found the ownership documents. Then they found the master lease. And finally, they discovered the clause that mattered most. The building was owned by Carter Property Holdings. The managing partner was Daniel Carter. Me. The CEO's office called an emergency meeting. I wasn't there. But later, one of my former colleagues told me what happened. David reportedly asked, "How much of the building does Carter own?" The attorney answered, "All of it." David asked, "Personally?" "Number through his property holding company." "Can he terminate the lease?" "Under certain conditions." "What conditions?" The attorney listed them. David went silent. Then Melissa asked, "Can we replace the landlord?" The attorney looked at her. "No." "Why not?" "Because Daniel is the landlord." The room reportedly went silent. Then someone asked, "Does he have any obligation to keep leasing to us?" The attorney answered, "Only according to the lease." That was the moment they understood. They hadn't simply fired an employee. They had created a conflict with the person who controlled their physical headquarters. And now the building itself had become part of the negotiation. That afternoon, David called me again. This time, his voice was completely different. "Daniel." "Yes." "Can we meet?" "About the lease." "Yes." "Sure." "Tomorrow." "Fine." When I arrived, the same security guard who had stopped me at the lobby was waiting. He looked embarrassed. "Mr. Carter." "James." "I'm sorry about Monday." "You were doing your job." He smiled. "Are you coming back upstairs?" I looked at the elevators. "No." He raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because I don't work there anymore." I walked past him, then stopped. "But I'm meeting the people who do." The meeting was held in the executive conference room. David sat at the head. Melissa sat beside him. The new CFO was there. 2 lawyers were there. And I sat across from them. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, David said, "We want to resolve this." "Good. We've reviewed the lease." "I assumed you would." "We're prepared to cure the violations." "Excellent. But we want the default notice withdrawn." I looked at my attorney. She nodded. I turned back. "I'll withdraw it once the violations are cured." David looked frustrated. "We need certainty." "You have certainty." "We need a longer lease." "That's possible." "We want an extension." "At market terms." He frowned. "You expect us to pay more." "The current lease was negotiated 9 years ago." "You know our situation." "I do." "Then help us." I leaned back. "I am helping you." Melissa finally spoke. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why didn't you ever tell us you own the building?" I thought about it. "Because it wasn't relevant to my job." "But it is now." "Yes." "Why didn't you use that power before?" "Because I didn't need to." She looked down. Then she said, "We treated you badly." I nodded. "Yes." "We made a mistake." "Yes." "Do you want us to apologize?" I looked at her. "No." She seemed surprised. "Why not?" "Because apologies don't fix contracts." My attorney smiled. I continued. "Let's fix the actual problem." We spent 4 hours negotiating. By the end, Westbridge agreed to cure the lease violations. They agreed to a new 5-year extension. They agreed to obtain written approval before subleasing any space. They agreed to comply with building requirements. And most importantly, they agreed to a formal separation from me as an employee. No retaliation. No interference. No threats. I was no longer part of Westbridge. But Westbridge would remain a tenant of my company. That was the arrangement. They had fired me, but they still needed the building. And I wasn't going to abuse that position. I wanted the agreement to be fair. That mattered. Because revenge can feel satisfying for a moment. But integrity lasts longer. I thought the story was over. It wasn't. 3 months later, I received a call from Laura. "Daniel, we have a problem." "What happened?" "Westbridge has missed 2 rent payments." I frowned. "How much?" "Enough to matter." "Are they having cash problems?" "Yes." I looked at the financial reports. Westbridge had been struggling since the investment group took over. They had cut too deeply. Lost experienced employees. Lost customers. And spent millions trying to expand. Now the company was running out of cash. I asked, "How long can they survive?" 6 months, maybe. I stared at the numbers. I could enforce the lease. I could terminate them. I could take back the building. And potentially force the company to move during a financial crisis. But hundreds of employees would suffer. I didn't want that. So I called David. "We need to talk." He sounded exhausted. "I know." "What's happening?" "Cash flow." "How bad?" "Bad." "Why didn't you tell me?" "You aren't part of the company." "No." "But you're our landlord." "Exactly." There was silence. Then he said, "Can we renegotiate?" "Maybe." "What do you want?" "I want the company to survive." He laughed bitterly. "Why?" "Because people work there." He didn't respond. I continued. "But survival requires changes." "What kind?" "Independent financial oversight." He hesitated. "You want to control us?" "No. I want you to stop making decisions that put the company at risk." That became the next battle. I spent 2 weeks reviewing Westbridge's finances. The problem wasn't the building. It wasn't payroll. It wasn't even the market. The problem was bad management. The investment group had demanded aggressive cost reductions. David had followed them. Melissa had pushed rapid expansion. They had closed profitable divisions because they weren't growing fast enough. They had cut senior employees. They had replaced experienced managers with cheaper staff. And they had spent millions on projects that hadn't generated revenue. The company wasn't broken. It was being mismanaged. I prepared a proposal. First, stop the expansion. Second, restore the strongest customer support teams. Third, renegotiate supplier agreements. Fourth, sell 2 non-core assets. Fifth, freeze executive bonuses. Sixth, restructure the debt. Seventh, keep the headquarters. That last point mattered. The building wasn't just an office. It was part of the company's operations. Moving would cost millions. If they could stay, they had a chance. I presented the plan to the board. They listened. Then one director asked, "Why are you doing this?" I answered, "Because I built part of this company." He nodded. "Even though they fired you?" "Yes." "Why?" I thought about it. "Because I don't want to become the kind of person they thought I was." The board approved the first phase. Within 4 months, the company stabilized. Customer retention improved. Expenses dropped. Cash flow recovered. Westbridge survived. And something unexpected happened. The investment group approached me. They wanted to buy the building. laughed when Laura told me. What did you say? I told them you'd consider it. I shook my head. Do you think I should? That's your decision. I looked at the building. 32 floors. 9 years of memories. And one very complicated history. Then I said, maybe. The investment group made an enormous offer. More money than I had expected. Enough to make selling the building extremely attractive. But I didn't accept immediately. Instead, I asked one question. What happens to the employees if you buy it? They said they would keep the lease. Good. What about the building? Same management. And the company. They would continue operating it. I thought about it. Then I asked, why do you want the building? The answer was simple. They wanted control. Not just of Westbridge. Of the entire property. That concerned me. So I made a counteroffer. I'll sell. They looked surprised. But under one condition. What? The company gets a long-term protected lease. How long? 10 years. They hesitated. At what rate? A fair market rate with reasonable increases. They agreed. The deal closed. I sold the building. But I kept one important thing. The employee's right to remain there under the lease. I walked away with a substantial return on the investment. But more importantly, I walked away free. The building was no longer my responsibility. Westbridge was no longer my problem. And I was no longer connected to the company. Except for one final thing. David called me the day after the sale. Daniel. Yes. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to. You could have taken the building back. I could have. You could have forced us out. I could have. You could have made millions more. Maybe. Why didn't you? I answered. Because winning doesn't mean making everyone else lose. He was quiet. Then he said, I wish I'd understood that when you worked for me. So do I. A week before I left Westbridge behind completely, Melissa asked to meet me. We sat in the lobby. The same lobby where I had once been stopped by security. She looked around. Funny. What? Last time we sat here, you couldn't get upstairs. I smiled. I remember. She looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. I know. I was ambitious. I know. I thought you were standing in my way. You weren't the first person to think that. She laughed. Then she became serious. I learned something. What? Power isn't always where you think it is. I nodded. That's true. I thought you were powerful because you were a senior executive. Instead, you were powerful because you had options. I smiled. That's a better definition. She continued. And because you didn't use your power against us. I looked at her. That was the hardest part. Why? Because revenge would have been easy. She nodded. What stopped you? I answered honestly. I remembered who I was before all of this. She looked down. I wish I had remembered that too. We sat in silence. Then she asked, Are you happy now? I smiled. Yes. Even after everything. Especially after everything. 6 months after the sale, I stopped following Westbridge's news. I had no reason to. I started a new investment company. I bought smaller commercial properties. I advised entrepreneurs. I funded several startups. And I hired people who had once worked with me. Then, one afternoon, an old colleague called. Daniel. Hey. Do you remember Westbridge? Of course. Things are different. How? They changed the leadership structure. Good. David stepped down. I wasn't surprised. Melissa is now CEO. That surprised me. Really? Yes. How's she doing? Actually, very well. I smiled. Good. She changed a lot. People can. She also created a new policy. What policy? Senior employees can't be terminated without an independent review. I laughed softly. That's probably a good policy. Then my colleague said, she also tells your story to new managers. I paused. My story. Yes. What does she say? He laughed. She tells them to check the lease before firing the landlord. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my phone. That was the first time I truly felt the weight of what had happened. Not because they regretted losing me, but because the lesson remained after I left. Almost 2 years later, a letter arrived at my office. It was from Westbridge. Inside was a photograph. The original Westbridge team. 12 people. 9 years earlier. I was standing in the middle. Richard was beside me. David was in the back. Melissa wasn't there yet. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten note. You taught us something we should have learned earlier. A company is not its building, its logo, or its executives. It's the people who build it and the trust that holds them together. There was one more sentence. Thank you for not letting us destroy ourselves. I put the photograph on my desk. For a long time, I stared at it. Then I realized something. I didn't miss Westbridge. I missed the people. The early days. The long nights. The feeling that we were building something together. But that version of the company was gone. And that's okay. Sometimes, you have to let go of what something was to make room for what comes next. People sometimes ask me, weren't you angry when they locked you out? Yes. Of course I was. I was hurt. Embarrassed. Disappointed. For a few hours, I questioned everything. 9 years. Gone. Just like that. But eventually, I realized something. They hadn't locked me out of my future. They had only locked me out of an office. And those are two very different things. My future wasn't inside that building. It was in my experience, my knowledge, my investments, my reputation, my relationships, my ability to rebuild. That's something no security guard can take away. The building had been important, but it wasn't my identity. That realization changed everything. Because when you stop believing that one job defines you, losing that job becomes less frightening. And when you stop believing that one company owns your future, you become free. If there's one thing I learned from this experience, it's that revenge can be tempting. When someone humiliates you, you want them to feel what you felt. When someone pushes you aside, you want to push back harder. When someone underestimates you, you want to prove them wrong. That's human. But there's a difference between justice and revenge. Justice protects what matters. Revenge tries to hurt what hurt you. I had the ability to make Westbridge's situation much worse. I could have enforced every lease violation. I could have demanded immediate payment. I could have refused the extension. I could have forced them to move. And maybe I would have been legally entitled to do some of those things. But entitlement isn't the same as wisdom. I asked myself one question. What outcome will I be proud of 5 years from now? That question changed my decisions. 5 years later, I didn't want to remember the day I locked a company out. I wanted to remember the day I helped people keep their jobs. I didn't want my victory to be someone else's collapse. I wanted my victory to be my freedom. And that's exactly what happened. A year after selling the Westbridge building, I bought a smaller office for my own company. It wasn't 32 floors. It wasn't impressive. It had 12 employees. A small reception area. A kitchen that was too small. and a conference room with a table that had one scratched corner. I loved it. On the first day, I stood in the lobby. The receptionist handed me a key. "Here you go." I smiled. "Thanks." She looked confused. "What?" "Nothing." I remembered another key. The one I had surrendered. The badge. The lobby. The security guard. The email. The humiliation. Then I looked at the new office. Nobody could fire me from the building. Not because I owned it, but because I finally understood something. A building isn't security. A job isn't security. A title isn't security. Skills are security. Character is security. And the ability to start again is security. I put the key in my pocket. Then I walked upstairs. Several months later, a young employee named Sarah came into my office. She was 26. Smart. Hardworking. And nervous. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She sat down. "How do you know when it's time to leave a company?" I thought about my own experience. Then I asked, "Why are you thinking about leaving?" She explained that her manager had been taking credit for her work. She had been ignored for promotions. She was angry. I listened. Then I said, "Don't leave because you're angry." She looked surprised. "Why?" "Because anger makes you want to escape." "What should I do?" "Document your work. Then, ask for what you deserve. And if they say no, then build your options." She nodded. "What if they fire me?" I smiled. "Then make sure being fired isn't the end of your story." She looked at me. "Did that happen to you?" "Yes." "What did you do?" I laughed. "They locked me out." She smiled. "Then what?" I looked at her. I realized I owned the master lease. Her eyes widened. "Seriously? Seriously?" She laughed. "That's the craziest revenge story I've ever heard." I shook my head. "It wasn't revenge." "What was it?" "Perspective." She thought about that. Then she smiled. "I think I understand." I hoped she did. Years later, I received a call from the new owner of the building. He introduced himself. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "Your lease structure saved us." I was confused. "How?" He explained that the long-term tenant agreement had protected the building during a difficult market period. Westbridge had remained a reliable tenant. The property remained occupied. The investment became more valuable. My old decision to protect the company had eventually benefited the new owner too. I smiled. "Funny how things work." He laughed. "You knew what you were doing." At the time, I was just trying to solve a problem. That's what good business people do. We talked for a few minutes. Before hanging up, he said, "Do you regret selling the building?" I looked out my office window. "No." "Why?" "Because I got something more valuable." "What?" "Freedom." I kept the entire Westbridge file for years. Contracts. Emails. The original lease. The default notice. The termination letter. The security records. The settlement documents. Everything. One evening, I opened the box. I read the termination email one last time. Effective immediately. I smiled. Then I put it back. I didn't need it anymore. I shredded the copies. Not because I wanted to forget. Because I didn't need proof anymore. The people involved had moved on. The company had survived. I had built a new life. And the story no longer controlled me. That was the final victory. Not the lease. Not the money. Not the building. Letting go. When people hear the title of my story, They imagine a dramatic confrontation. They imagine me walking into the lobby with lawyers. They imagine me saying, "Do you know who owns this building?" But that never happened. The real story was quieter. They locked me out. I went home. I called my attorney. I reviewed the lease. I followed the law. I gave them a chance to fix their mistakes. And when they did, I let them. That's not as dramatic as revenge. But it's stronger. Because I didn't allow their behavior to change who I was. They wanted me gone. I left. They thought I had lost. I rebuilt. They thought they controlled the building. They discovered they didn't. They thought they had ended my career. They accidentally gave me the freedom to start something better. And eventually, they became the people thanking me for not using my power against them. That's what made the story worth remembering. If you've ever been pushed aside, betrayed, ignored, or treated like you don't matter, remember this. You may lose a position. You may lose a title. You may even lose something you spent years building. But you don't have to lose yourself. Don't let one company's decision become your identity. Don't let one person's disrespect determine your future. And don't confuse revenge with victory. Real victory is walking away stronger. It's building something new. It's knowing your worth without needing the people who hurt you to admit it. The day Westbridge locked me out, they thought they were closing a door. They didn't realize they were opening another one. They thought I was just an employee. They didn't know I controlled the master lease. But even that wasn't my greatest advantage. My greatest advantage was that I had options. I could walk away. I could rebuild. I could choose peace. And when the moment came to decide whether I would use my power to punish them or protect what remained, I chose the second option. Because anyone can destroy something when they're angry. It takes strength to save it. That was the lesson I carried with me. The building didn't make me powerful. The lease didn't make me powerful. Money didn't make me powerful. The ability to choose what kind of person I would be after betrayal. That was real power. They locked me out of the office. But they never locked me out of my future. And that's why they didn't get the last word. I did. Not with a threat. Not with revenge. Not with anger. Just by walking away. And building a life they could no longer control. The end.